I think this still scares me so much because it involved my daughter. It's the summer of 2016 and we just purchased a new house. The washer and dryer included with it were brand new. We already had a set, albeit much older. We saw a chance to make a little money and listed them on Craigslist. I hadn't even been aware of the place before my son suggested it. It was surprising to me how fast the call started. We expected it would take the weekend at least before we had a buyer. Several people wanted to pick it up the following morning. Unfortunately, our family was traveling to a reunion and wouldn't be around to let them in. Every caller was told whoever arrived first Monday morning would be the lucky buyer. The terms were set and we headed out the following morning. That night we received a panic call from our daughter. She had stayed behind because of illness. Something truly scary and extraordinary had happened just hours before. She said she was laying in bed, watching TV and heard a loud crash. Then, voices echoed from the living room. Not sure what to do, she stayed still and listened. When she was certain it wasn't us, she grabbed her phone and hid in the closet. The voices of two men drew closer and stopped outside her door. They were talking about looking for something. She feared that they were there to kidnap her. The dispatcher kept her calm and they made small talk until the cops arrived. A ruckus could be heard coming from the living room along with some yelling. Then, everything went silent. The dispatcher stopped talking for a moment. Seconds passed, then it was all over. The dispatcher spoke up and told her she could come out. She emerged and introduced herself just as the last thief was being let out. It took a week or two to get the full story. The interrogations uncovered their reason for the break-in. The pair had intended on buying the washer and dryer, at least at first. When I mentioned we'd be out of town, they decided to just break in and take them. Both swore they never knew my daughter was there. I thank my maker they didn't. No telling what could have happened. After first making sure our girl was okay, we returned home that night. I remember shaking like a leaf the whole drive back. I jumped from the car before my husband could park it. The second I saw her, I gave her a big hug and didn't let go for a long time. My husband and I spoke to the police the following morning. They assured us because of their previous convictions, the burglars would do prison time. They were still inside the last time I heard and wouldn't be released before 2025. However, with all the cons getting out because of the lockdown, I fear they may be among them. Although our daughter seems to have left it in the past, the long-term effects still aren't clear. If they are released early, I hope any hidden trauma doesn't rear its head and set her recovery back. As for the washer and dryer, a nice young couple picked it up that Monday morning. We happened to run into them a few months ago and they said both units were still working well. I mentioned to them what happened that weekend and they were shocked, but still able to find the funny side. I'm glad things went well and we were both able to laugh about it now. Every day we hear of families that weren't so lucky and I'm thankful to not be among them. It was May of last year and I had just signed the lease on a new house. It turned out the refrigerator didn't come with the deal. I'd spent most of my money on the house, so I started looking for a cheap one at garage sales. I couldn't find any that way. Then, I remembered Craigslist. After just 10 minutes, one popped up, not far from me. I called the number and a nice lady answered. She said the refrigerator was still for sale, but she couldn't guarantee it would still be there when I arrived. So, against my better judgment, I asked for her PayPal and sent her the $75. She sent me an email confirming she got the money and we set a date for me to pick it up. That Saturday, I texted her, letting her know I was on my way. The house was a nice ranch-style place, probably built in the 80s. I knocked and this hot brown-haired girl in very short cutoffs answered. After I picked my jaw from the ground, I asked her for Sunny. She said that was her and showed me inside. I had zero reason to be nervous. Like the outside, the house was nicely finished and smelled clean. We made small talk for a few minutes until this big dude, at least 6'5", covered in tattoos, appeared from the kitchen. She introduced me to him as John, her boyfriend, and she said he would take me to the refrigerator. She disappeared to the back of the house and I never saw her again. John led me through the kitchen to the garage. He opened the door and pointed to the refrigerator. It was all the way across from me, almost sitting against the overhead door. I could barely see it because the garage itself was so dark. I asked him if there was a light, but he said it had broken and they hadn't had the chance to fix it. No big deal. He had to open the overhead door so I could move it out anyway. I asked him to raise it, but he said it was also broken. He apologized. I was just going to have to bring it through the house. This annoyed me, but I had no choice at that point. There was a little light shining in from the house. It was going to have to do. I took 2 steps, maybe 3, into the garage before I realized that there was plastic on the floor. I looked down and saw that it covered the entire floor. This was when I began getting nervous. I couldn't think of any reason why it would be there except I stopped in my tracks. John's shadow began drawing closer. Then, off in the corner to my left, I heard a shuffling noise. Everything inside of me said to leave. Suddenly, I turned around and walked quickly back to open the door. I was surprised to see how close John was actually to me, but I kept going. I weaved around him and said, I forgot my dolly in the truck. I'll be right back." There was a dolly leaning against the wall not far away. He pointed to it and began to say something, but I didn't stop. When I was sure he wasn't behind me anymore, I ran the rest of the way, out the door, all the way to my truck. I hopped in it and tore out of there. I don't know what happened after that. I got a few texts from Dawn, but I erased them without reading them. When I got home, I logged on to Craigslist to report them. I was shocked to see that the listing was already gone. I looked around for another 30 minutes to make sure. They must have erased it right away. I also called the police and made a report. They seemed a little dubious of my claim, but promised to check it out. I never heard from them again, and I don't much care. I'm alive, and that's good enough for me. As for the $75, there was no way I was going to ask for it back. It wasn't worth getting involved with those freaks again. I haven't gone on the site since then. The whole system strikes me as risky these days. Anyway, I got lucky a week later. There was a garage sale in my neighborhood that had a used refrigerator. It was $100, but a lot nicer than the one, and it serves its purpose just fine. As I wrap this up, I don't want to give people the wrong idea. I don't think Craigslist is dangerous for you to use. Thousands of folks get stuff off of there every day with no trouble. But after what happened to me, I just don't think it's worth the risk. However, if you do find something on the site, you just have to be careful. Bring a friend when you go to get it. If you can, meet in a public place during the day. Most importantly, though, use your head. If the situation seems sketchy, bail. It may mean the difference between life and death. All this happened because I saw a YouTube video about a shelf unit stereo. I've been looking for one for some time. The addition of a decent turntable sold me. My first stop was Amazon. Unfortunately, they wanted more than I could afford, so I hopped on eBay. I came across a few there, but all the sellers' feedback ratings were lower than I liked. At first, I thought it was SOL. Then I remembered Craigslist. Within 10 minutes, I'd found my stereo. I contacted the seller, and we agreed to meet at Walmart at around 8 p.m. I grabbed the cash and left about 7:30. Our arrangement was to meet close to the building. I drove around the lot for a good 15 minutes before I gave up. I just figured I'd been trolled. However, as I headed toward the exit by the highway, I saw 2 men waving their arms. It had to be the sellers, so I pulled over and parked. I asked why they had parked so far from the store. One guy claimed that there were no parking spaces when they arrived. From what I could see, there were plenty. I let it go, though. There was no point in angering them. Maybe they were just stupid. There's plenty of folks like that around here. The taller of the 2 made small talk for a few minutes. I didn't want to be rude, so I humored him. The moment he stopped speaking, I tried to get the sale in motion. While we were talking, I hadn't noticed that the other guy had snuck up behind me. When I pulled the cash from my pocket, I got a hard nudge in my back. This caused me to jerk upright. When I looked at the tall guy, he had a pistol pointed at me. My instinct was to yell for help, but the two guns suggested against it. It was obviously a robbery. The tall guy didn't have to ask. I handed the cash to him and he kindly said thank you, and I hope that was the end of it. They drive away and I'd be left scared and feeling stupid. But I was wrong. The tall guy demanded I give up my phone. That was going to hurt more than the money. It was a brand new iPhone. I reluctantly pulled it from my pocket and took one last look. The entire time the other guy didn't say a word. Now they had what they wanted. The two men got in the car and drove away, leaving me shaking in fear and feeling like a fool. I'd convinced myself I'd taken the proper measures to prevent stuff from going wrong, but the moment they changed the plan, I went ahead anyway, despite any misgivings I had. Now I was minus $100 in cash and a $400 phone. Without a phone, I had to walk the 200 yards to the store to call the cops. The employees tried to be sympathetic, but I'm sure they thought I was stupid too. The police arrived soon and took my statement. I respect them for being honest with me. We all knew the guys probably wouldn't be caught, and they haven't been. Almost 4 years on, and I have yet to hear of an arrest. I suppose I should be grateful it didn't cost me more. Had my assailants been of the mind to, I could have paid the ultimate price. This may sound strange to some people, but I collect movies on VHS. My collection is currently over 1,000 and growing daily. I spend my weekends searching through thrift shops and online sellers for interesting and hard-to-find cassettes. Sometimes I'll purchase boxes of tapes. These often include home recordings of forgotten television shows and family memories deemed no longer important. There was a time I loved nothing more than to cuddle up and watch them with my girlfriend. Although most turn out to be boring, I occasionally stumble across something very special. A couple of years ago, I was browsing through Craigslist and came across a box of cassettes. It was taking up space and they wanted it gone. Frida the first person to show up, so I pounced on the deal. An hour later, I was parked in front of my TV with a big box of tapes. The haul totaled 44. Many were blank or home recordings lacking labels. Oh well, I always love a mystery. And a few hours before work and watched a tape or two on Fast Forward. The first had an episode of the original Battlestar Galactica and the other was blank. Once I was done, I pushed the box into the closet and left for work. It would stay there for another 9 months, untouched and forgotten. In the meantime, I bought countless more tapes and my collection began to take over my spare bedroom. I built a massive shelf to store it all and inventoried each tape as I shelved them. This is how I remembered the box in my closet. When I realized I hadn't finished watching each tape, I set aside an evening with my girlfriend to do so. I remember that night like it was yesterday. My girlfriend, Brittany, arrived just after 7 p.m. We made dinner together and had Butterfinger ice cream for dessert. At about 9, we curled up together and started the first tape. The next few hours, we saw a recording of NBC Primetime from 1987, 3 movies from HBO, and a wedding from 1991. Brittany especially loved that one. The fourth tape was also a wedding. I watched as much as I could before opting on a pee break and having a smoke. When I stepped away, she was fully engrossed in the ceremony. After I hit the head, I slipped out on the porch for a cigarette. That only took 5 minutes max. Before I returned to the bedroom, I grabbed a refill of water. I was in the process of doing this when I heard Brittany scream my name. I ran into the room as fast as possible. She had her hands over her mouth and her eyes were the size of saucers. Her gaze seemed to be fixed on the TV. What? I said. I leaned over the TV but saw nothing but a blue screen. I asked her again. She remained speechless but pressed rewind on the VCR. A few seconds later, she pressed play and patted on the spot next to her. I assumed this meant sit down, so I did. The tape began as the happy couple prepared to cut the cake. I got annoyed and asked, "What's going on with you?" "Just wait a second, it's coming." The words were so sudden I jumped. So I kept watching, waiting for some mystery thing to occur. The couple were feeding one another cake and the recording cut out. The static blared at us for a moment before a new recording began. Now, a man was staring at us. He looked to be starting a video camera. When he moved away from the camera, you could see a nude woman laying on a bed. The guy hopped on the bed, and they began doing it. "All right, baby," I said in a joking way. Brittany snapped and told me to shut up. By this point, I was completely dumbfounded. I almost felt embarrassed watching it. I'd never thought of myself as the sort of voyeuristic type. The couple continued coupling, and the woman whispered, "Choke me." He did, and it began to peak. I'm thinking, kinky, to myself. Not my thing, but to each his own. The man continues to choke the woman. She began gasping for air, but he didn't stop. Even when she grabbed his arms, he kept going. He completed the act and let go of her throat. The couple lay quietly together for a few moments and said nothing. Suddenly, the man turns toward the woman. He stares for a few seconds, then raises his eyebrows and starts shaking her. The dude's yelling her name and occasionally slapping her cheeks, but she's not moving. This is when I started to catch on. The man then stands up, now holding his partner by the shoulders and shaking her. Still no movement. This is when he started to catch on. He eventually stops and just stares into her empty eyes. No way, man. I'm beginning to freak out now. No way, dude. Brittany is silent. The man sat down on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands. A low sobbing can be heard. This goes on for a few moments before he remembers the camera. In one long motion, he reaches out and slams his hand down on it. The blaring of the static returned, and I sat struck dumb. The hissing continued until Brittany finally pressed stop. Dude. It was the only word I could get out. I'd never seen anything like that before. Brittany turned toward me and asked what we should do. I honestly had no idea. I still couldn't believe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. Let me have a smoke and I'll consider our options. I retreated outside to think. When I returned, I proposed the idea that it may have been fake. I don't want to go to the cops until I'm sure it's real. No way do I want to become the butt of some troll's joke. Okay. If she had any misgivings, she kept them to herself. She may have still been in shock. I know I was. Our evening was clearly over. I suggested she stay the night, but she declined. No big deal. I'd have a hard time getting any sleep until I knew the truth. My first goal was to contact the tape's previous owner. I knew for sure the man in the tape wasn't the dude I got the box from. There was a good chance he may know his identity, though. My emails went unanswered. I tried to contact him by phone, but his number no longer worked. I finally went by his place and discovered that he had completely moved. Without a way to contact him, my options had run out. Off to the police it would be. The cops said that they would watch the video and contact me if they had any additional questions. It was out of my hands now. In the weeks during my search, I'd seen very little of Brittany. She'd always had some excuse. I figured it was only a matter of time before she ended things completely. Another week would pass before she'd call. I can't do this anymore. I haven't slept for weeks. All I can see is that dead woman. There was no use or sense in arguing with her. I wished her a good life and hung up. It would have been heartless to expect her to just let something like this go. God knows I'd had my fair share of bad dreams over the past month. Things like that tend to affect women a lot harder than us. If her feelings change in the future, I'm not hard to find. Hundreds of cassettes have passed through my hands since then. With room now becoming scarce, I've taken to selling blank tapes and extra copies of films. With Brittany no longer in the picture, I admit curling up in bed and watching the tapes has lost a bit of its luster. Most of my viewing takes place in the living room now. To this day, every time I put an unlabeled tape in the player, I get a little tinge of fear. Will I see someone die? I've had a lot of time to think it over. When you collect something that captures a moment in time, a sliver of someone's life, you never know what terrible secret you may uncover. Maybe 2.5 years back, I met a chick at a bar. She had been stood up, and I had just knocked off for the day. I didn't go there with any idea to score. I just wanted a couple of pints to help me unwind. I'd been there around 45 minutes when the bartender slipped me a note. It was from a girl sitting at the end of the bar. She asked me to grab a table with her so we could talk. My curiosity was piqued, so I looked to my right and locked eyes with possibly the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. I thought maybe I'd been given the note accidentally. No way a girl that hot was interested in me. To make sure, I pointed at the note and mouthed, "Was this for me?" Then I pointed to myself. To my amazement, she nodded yes, and that's where our evening began. I grabbed a quiet table in the corner and she joined me. We introduced ourselves before getting to the small talk. Her name was Amber and she was 25. Close up, she was even more beautiful. I asked her why she'd written the note. I was genuinely curious. While I'm not a walking mess, I was nowhere near her level. The possibility I was being tricked came to mind, so I asked if I was being pranked, but she said no. It wouldn't be the first time. My friends seemed to think it was funny any girl would like me. They put notes on my windshield at least twice, pretending to be from a secret admirer. I never fell for it. I'm far smarter than they think I am. This, however, looked to be a real encounter. If it was, I was going to play it all the way through. The getting to know each other continued another hour until she asked if I wanted to take her home. I jumped on it, and we walked the few blocks to my apartment. We had a few more drinks and started messing around. I don't kiss and tell, so I'll just say we enjoyed one another's presence for the rest of the night. When I awakened the next morning, she's already gone. I wrote it off as an amazing dream and went to bed. When I came out, a pair of beer bottles caught my eye. I walked over to get a closer look. One had lipstick residue on the mouth. I still wasn't completely positive. I walked over to the bed and sniffed the pillow opposite mine. The wonderful smell threw me back to the previous evening. There was no doubt. It had really happened. I was over the moon for a long time. I hoped to see her again. I went as far as asking some employees if they knew how to find her, but none did. As time went by, however, I wrote it off as a one-night stand. I began dating a new girl, a wonderful, fun chick to be around, but Amber stayed in the forefront of my mind. This new relationship never really went anywhere, and we ended things a few months in. Being newly single, I hoped to track Amber down and maybe pick back up where we'd left off. I returned to the bar and asked around again. I got the same answer. I didn't have the money to hire a detective, and without a last name, I couldn't do a search on the internet. Providence would arrive in the form of Craigslist. I was browsing the site and came across the Missed Connections section. It looked to be just as good as any other avenue, so I made a short description of our night together and how I'd like to meet again. I posted it and went on with my life. All was quiet until about day 8. A message came from someone claiming to be Amber. I asked a few questions. They knew all the answers and even added things no one else could have known. I was overjoyed to be talking with her again and asked if we could meet for drinks. She agreed and suggested the place we first met. It sounded perfect, almost romantic. I started to believe this may actually go somewhere. My months-long search was over. For the rest of the week, my stomach was in knots. I was counting the hours. Saturday eventually arrived, and I made my way to meet her. She was visible from outside and more beautiful than I remembered. I joined her at the table, and the night went much as it had our first evening, all but one thing. Throughout the evening, she checked her phone many times. I assumed she was just nervous and tried to ignore it. It was a few hours before she suggested that we go back to her place. I've been looking forward to this for months. On our way out, I visited the bathroom. As I walked out, I noticed she was fiddling with her phone again. However, now she was making a call. I didn't care. Besides, maybe she was calling a roommate. She was basically a stranger to me. For all I knew, she had kids. Once again, I really didn't care. She'd hung up by the time I returned anyway, and we made our way to her car. I stumbled my way down the street until she pointed at this plain 4-door sedan, and I shuffled up to the passenger door. She unlocked it, and I fell into the seat. We closed our doors, but Instead of starting the car, she just sat there and smiled at me. Oh, she wants to make out. The idea perked me up. When I leaned over to kiss her, a strange male voice told me to stop. What? I was so drunk I had a difficult time assessing the situation. I turned my head to the back seat and saw a large, masked man pointing a gun at me. "Don't make me shoot you, cowboy." Instantly, I sobered up. I could tell he meant every word. I looked over to Amber. Our eyes met, and I knew I'd been tricked. They were cold, lacking any empathy. I was devastated. I'd lost my desire to live in that moment. Moving much faster than I should have, I yanked my wallet from my pocket and threw it into the back seat. I think my nonchalance caught the man off guard. He said nothing, even as I stepped from the car and slammed the door. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood mute, staring at the pavement. It remained quiet for around 30 seconds until I heard the car start and speed away. It wasn't long before I had a massive adrenaline dump. The seriousness of what had occurred mere moments prior hit me like a truck. I hunched over and actually began vomiting. Massive amounts of booze and nachos poured from my guts. I eventually ran dry and returned to my feet. I wiped my mouth and made my way home. I wanted nothing but to sleep and didn't even bother to undress before falling into bed. Most of the day was gone when I woke up. I chugged a bottle of Gatorade, my hangover cure. The events of the previous night became clearer by the second. I felt so stupid. All the time I'd wasted looking for her. Then I got angry and my desire for revenge kicked in. A quick shower and a 2-mile walk later, I found myself filing report. In Chicago, stick-ups generally don't get much attention. When the detective handed me some mugshots, I got the idea I'd stumbled into something a tad more serious. I was shocked to see the faces of Amber and her accomplice staring back at me. I pointed them out. When the detective handed me some mugshots, I got the idea I'd stumbled into something a tad more serious. I was shocked to see the faces of Amber and her accomplice staring back at me. I pointed them out, and the detective gave me the lowdown. Only at that moment did I realize just how lucky I'd been. According to him, I had fallen prey to a scam. Amber's real name was Shannon, and she'd been a career con artist. The pair had been targeting single men for the last 6 months or more. I was thought to be their 5th victim, and the previous 3 had actually been killed. And I felt a shudder through my body. The detective was unsure why I'd been allowed to live, and that made 2 of us. Perhaps our history made me too much of a risk. Maybe she'd been pressured into doing it by her partner. I'll probably never know. It was hoped that I had new information to give him, but I ended up being no help. We spoke a little longer before he sent me home. Now I was even more confused. I was happy to be alive. On the other hand, however, I wondered why I'd been spared. I have one particularly funny theory that they didn't consider $23 and a maxed-out card worth killing over, but the truth is, it's not really a joking matter. Things wouldn't get any clearer when Amber's accomplice was arrested. He'd be brought in on unrelated charges, only to lawyer up the second he was asked any questions. He'll stay mum more than likely, even when presented with the possibility of execution. The detective on my case thinks Amber probably won't be caught for a long time, and even if she is, she'll go the way of silence too. If and when she is caught, I hope I can get a few minutes alone with her, not because I wish her any harm. I've come to terms with her role in the crime. Instead, rather, I'd like to ask why I was spared when others weren't. I'd like to think it's because we'd made some type of connection on an emotional level. Then again, that's probably just my romantic side thinking out loud. In truth, it probably just wasn't my time. I want to preface this by saying, despite changing names and the use of a throwaway, everything else I write here is 100% true. Although I myself am not the subject of the story, I'm choosing to stay anonymous because of the stigma related to the content found within. A stigma I happen to agree with, by the way. Now, with that out of the way, here are the facts. I have a friend I've known since grade school. Because of difficulties he has with advanced math, he wasn't allowed to graduate. A foolish state law, in my opinion. Therefore, he left school our senior year. Lacking a high school diploma frustrated his ability to acquire any good work. Despite his clearly high level of intelligence and experience with computers, he had to settle with a job at the local transfer station or dump for the less savvy. It's the place the trash trucks drop off their loads and trailers take the garbage to the landfill from there. I know more about trash than I care to know, clearly. No one has to tell you about the large amount of waste taking place in our culture, and because of this waste, my friend Robert, we'll call him, saw an opportunity to make extra money. He noticed a lot of old computers were being thrown away. Since he was well versed in the field, he got an idea. He began bringing discarded laptops and towers home to repair. Not all, in fact, most of them were junk, but a few proved to be unexpected gems. At first, he only sold on eBay, but because of the rising cost of shipping, he moved most over to Craigslist. In no time, he was well known in the area as a top-notch computer builder. I'd wager 50% of the laptops in the county came from him. As a matter of fact, I'm writing this on a computer he actually gave me. And because of this reputation, he was making more than enough to quit the job at the dump. They would have cut him off from his supply or at least added an extra cost he didn't need. And so he stayed on. My reason for writing brings us to April this year. Robert had come across a pair of HP laptops, one of them almost new. He chose to keep the older model for daily use. He just recently sold his after being offered a price too good to refuse. It was a super-duper decked-out laptop someone had used for video production. As usual, it was found at the transfer station, like all the others. The newer of the pair was only 2 years old and didn't appear to have any problems. This would make selling it that much easier. His usual process was to go through a computer and remove anything not on it at the time of sale. He was performing a primary search of the new HP and came across a password-protected file. This piqued his curiosity. Yes, sometimes computers had a password required to log on, but he'd never seen a single file protected, not on any he'd found. Many of us may use a password on our banking or tax files. This was what Robert assumed he discovered. It had to come off regardless, so he did his thing and cracked it. And what he found sickened him. Since I'm aware some reading this may be survivors of this type of assault, I'll try to be as brief as possible. 5 gigabytes of CP is what it was. Not all of it was intimate in nature either. He said there looked to be some beatings, even some snuff. And this is where I come into the story. Robert called me, terrified and crying. He described what he found and promised he only watched enough to verify what it was. I believed him, naturally. He's the last guy I'd think to look at that garbage. But anyway, he continued sobbing, promising he didn't download it. I did the best I could to calm him, but he was obviously terrified. When he eventually chilled a little, we talked about his options. We agreed the police needed to see it. The problem was how to give it to them. Just having that stuff is illegal, whether it's yours or not, so I came up with the safest idea I could. Robert considered it a moment and agreed. After first wiping his prints from the laptop, he wrapped it in Christmas paper and taped a note explaining the situation at the top, minus his name, of course. He drove out to our mall and walked into the police station located inside. To avoid being identified, he wore a plain black hoodie and mask. We hoped he'd fit in because of the whole quarantine situation, and when no one was looking, he set the computer on the counter and walked away. Unfortunately, a cop caught him on his way out. Once they saw the note and the contents of the laptops, his fears came true. Countless hours of denials did no good, and news of his arrest spread quickly around town. A bail hearing was held, but the amount of $50,000 might as well have been $1 million. This means he's stuck in jail for the foreseeable future. In a larger town, I imagine his life would be in danger, but the few times we've spoken, he's claimed to have had no problems. I can only hope it stays that way until we can clear his name and get him out. The guilt I carry for suggesting the stupid plan is part of why I'm telling the story. I'm also livid because of the lies we are raised to believe. Honesty is the best policy. This may be the biggest lie ever sold to man. Tell me why a decent, hard-working man is in jail for doing the right thing. He discovers proof of a horrible crime taking place and tries to leave it with the authorities. What does he get for this? You may say, but he tried to do it in a deceitful way. You are correct, but what course of action did he have? Just having that evil in your possession is a crime no matter what. What happens when he tells the truth? No one believes him, that's what. Why would anyone do what he did if they were guilty? Now my purpose may be becoming clear. It is a lesson, a horrible example of why honesty is not always the best policy. I want the next person who finds himself in the same spot to know he benefits in no way by doing the right thing. The damage was already done to the victims when it was made. Nothing you can do can alter that. Just delete it and go on with your life. You're not a bad person, only thinking pragmatically. If only Robert had known that then, he would be free today. Anybody who's a father out there knows we'll bend over backwards for our kids, especially for our daughters. Mine is at that age where she's learning to ride a bike. She's off of training wheels, and because of the rate at which she's growing, she was ready for a better bicycle. The two of us sat down and browsed the internet for ideas. As you can imagine, she liked the more expensive models. I didn't have the heart to tell her that we didn't have the money for a new one, so I waited till I was alone and searched for used ones. That's how I came across Craigslist. There was a few available in the area, but they were incredibly beat up. If I was going to pass it off as new, I needed a bike in good shape. I continued to look and eventually found a like-new bike for a good price. Almost too good. My suspicions were raised, but I figured I'd check it out anyway. If it was in worse shape than the photos let on, I'd walk away. My wife and I went to the seller's house to see it. To my surprise, it was just as nice, almost brand new. I smelled a rat and questioned the seller. He claimed he had purchased it for his daughter, but she only rode it a handful of times. The bike showed very little use, so I took him at his word. I paid the man and we took it home. My daughter's birthday was coming up and we decided to give it to her then. I hid it away in our shed until the time came. The morning of her party, I let her outside. I told her to cover her eyes, and when I gave the okay, I unveiled the bike. She was naturally ecstatic. I got a big hug and thank you. She hopped on and rode it until her party that afternoon. I figured my job had been done and the bike would last her a few years at least. The next few weeks were life as normal. My daughter rode with her friends after school and weekends. Other than adjusting the seat, I had little work to do on it. I should have expected something would go wrong. It was a Sunday afternoon. My daughter, who we'll call Alex, was riding in the street in front of the house with her cousin. All of a sudden, I heard some screaming and crying outside. I ran out to see what was wrong, and Alex is sitting in the street, holding her leg. As I got closer, I saw blood pouring out of it. I'll admit, I got a bit nervous. I reached her and asked her what happened. Now that I was there, I could see just how bad the injury was. Halfway down on the inside of her left leg, the skin was split to the bone. I could see the muscle, in fact. Alex was bawling her head off, and I tried to calm her down. Once again, I asked her what happened. Lucky for me, her cousin wasn't fazed. He pointed behind me and said, "A pedal broke off and cut her." I turned around, and there was a pedal on the ground. I picked it up and noticed the part connecting the pedal to the crank arm is sheared off, leaving behind sharp little points. The other half was still in the crank and had left the same sharp pieces. I started getting angry when I realized the post steel looked like some cheap pot metal instead. I'm not sure if I'm describing this well, but imagine a stick broken in half. The two pieces you have left have sharp points located at the break. Essentially, you are left with two sharp sticks. Well, I sent the cousin inside to tell my wife about what happened while I whisked Alex off to the ER. I wasn't sure how to apply first aid, so I left it alone. Once we reached the hospital, I let them treat the wound. Alex eventually got some painkillers and she calmed down. She got the leg cleaned up and sewn up, and we made arrangements with a cosmetic surgeon to have it prettied up. This entire time, I'm quietly seething over the pedal's shoddy quality. We made it home that night, and I scoured the internet for information about the bike. It turned out that this is a common problem with this particular bike. So common, in fact, they had a recall to replace the pedals. Learning this did my burning fury no good. The recall had been made over 2 years prior to me buying the bike. As I calmed down, though, I realized I was guilty for not checking up on it more thoroughly. I'll own that. That may have contributed to my anger. I've already apologized to Alex and my wife for failing as a father. While I was in the process of my apology tour, a nugget found its way into my head. I wonder if the seller was aware of this problem and withheld it from me. It ate away at me until I was driven to call and ask. I played my cards close to my vest early on. My question was simply stated, and I left out Alex's injury. He tried to say it had slipped his mind. Then he went on to say all I needed to do was contact the company to get a free pair of pedals. It shouldn't be much trouble. I imagine it's a simple process. This is when I lost my cool and pounced. Oh yeah? Then why didn't you do it before selling it? My daughter has a giant gash in her leg because you were too lazy to send it off for free pedals. Either that, or you sold it knowing full well what could have happened. Which is it? I blindsided him. He just mumbled, never able to come up with an appropriate response. I was so mad by this time I was positive he'd sold the bike knowing of the dangers associated and the existence of the recall. He'd done as much as admitted to it, and that's the moment I decided I was going to sue him. Well, I'll see you in court, a-hole. Except I called him the whole word, obviously. I hung up before he could respond. It was the best I'd felt in weeks. Although I should have consulted with our lawyer before saying it, after we had, he was sure we had a case. I initially wanted to go for the big bucks. The guy was a doctor, after all. However, after I cooled off, all I really wanted was Alex's medical bills paid and an apology. Our lawyer and his would exchange some phone calls back and forth until they agreed to settle. Alex got her bills taken care of, and he promised to meet face-to-face for an apology. Later that week, he met us at a lunch and apologized to me. He surprised me and even apologized to Alex. She accepted it gracefully, and I thanked him for showing up. I'd become so wrapped up in my own little search for revenge, I'd forgotten one important thing. My wonderful daughter no longer had a bicycle. There was no way I was going to let her ride that death trap again, so I took a hunk of our tax return and bought her a brand new one. It's what I should have done in the first place. I spent a whole week of nights after work researching the pros and cons of several bikes until I chose the best one. It was more than I wanted to spend, but after all, if we don't think of our children's safety ahead of money, we don't deserve their love, now do we? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. Enjoy my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly, and if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, what are you doing, Step Frog?